Good morning and welcome to this week's Insight AppSAD webinar. My name is James and I'm one of the clinical educators here with Insight. I'd like to begin our session this morning by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. We're coming to you from Miagin here, or Brisbane, at the VAADA building, the traditional owners being the Turrbal and the Yagara people. And I'd like to extend that respect and acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us in webinar land today. So welcome again after a short break from the school holidays. Welcome to our new term, taking us through to the end of the year. And today we have one of our good friends, from Insight's good friends, Associate Professor Victoria Manning, who is a lecturer in addictions with Monash University, but also the head of research and workforce development with Turning Point. So again, we're very, I guess, honoured and privileged to have people of such great calibre as Associate Professor Manning come along to speak to us today. And as always, in the alcohol and drug field, it's always the search for new and different and better ways of supporting the people and their loved ones who we work with. And I think we have that topic in that vein today with looking at neurocognitive training and its use in the Swipe app. So what we'll do today is in a few moments' time, Victoria, who I can see on screen there, thank you very much for popping on. Victoria will take us through this topic and some of the preliminary findings yet to be published on some research that's been undertaken using this particular type of modality. Feel free, as we go through, to pop any questions or comments into the chat. We'll try and get to as many of those at the end of our session and the presentation this morning. I do apologise in advance if we don't get through all. And also just wanted to let all our keen attendees know today that there won't be a copy of the slides, predominantly because of the fact that the research is yet to be published. So the slides will not be available from the session today, but certainly the information is being generously shared with us at this point. So without any further ado, Victoria, I'll hand over to you. Everything seems to be working with you control of the screen there. And
so good. Thanks, James. Thanks for the very kind introduction. It's great to be back here, or virtually here, back at Insight. And thanks to the team for the invitation. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Myself here in West Preston, Melbourne. I'm on Wurundjeri land, and I pay respect to all Australians, elders past, present and emerging. So before I get started, in the interest of disclosure, I wanted to just share that we are currently exploring commercialisation of the Swipe app. And whilst this has all happened since I had the invitation to come and do this talk, and indeed since having the results of the study, I just wanted to be transparent about that before sharing the results with you today. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with cognitive bias modification, or specifically approach bias modification, which is the approach I'm talking about today, too many times I've used the word approach in that one sentence, sorry about that. But according to the dual process model of addiction, the paradox of continuing to drink despite experiencing harms and often despite a desire to quit can be explained by alterations in two independent but interconnected information processing systems. So the first is this reflective or cognitive control system, which becomes underactive, and that's largely due to the neurotoxic effects of alcohol on the prefrontal cortex. But the result of that is a weakened ability to monitor or regulate behaviour and to keep those long-term goals in mind when making decisions, and also a weakened ability to inhibit impulsive behaviours. And that's sort of represented by the sort of purple area, the prefrontal cortex of the brain in this figure here. At the same time, we have an overactive, impulsive motivation sort of automatic system. And this is because of changes in the reward system. It becomes increasingly sensitized due to the strong associations between alcohol and alcohol-related stimuli. So in essence, the stimuli associated with alcohol takes on these sort of attention-grabbing and motivational properties that we tune into, which then influences behaviour, even when we don't want to be drinking. And sometimes you'll hear a car analogy used to describe a dual process model. People talk about having a car with a really high rev engine, high on the gas, coupled with poor brakes. So what this means for clients often is drinking becomes increasingly and more automatically influenced by these alcohol cues in our environment due to the development of cognitive biases. And this includes attentional bias, which is the tendency for our attention to be diverted or automatically drawn towards alcohol cues in our surrounding environment, and also approach bias, the automatic action tendency to respond to or move towards alcohol cues. And I'm sure we have many clinicians online here today, and as you know, most psychological treatments like CBT do aim to strengthen conscious processes, but they tend not to address and therefore leave intact these more sort of automatic subconscious processes that drive drug-seeking behaviour. And since there's research suggesting attentional bias and approach bias has been shown to predict heavy alcohol use and relapse, it's really the last decade or so that it's become a therapeutic target for addiction treatment. But the good news is these cognitive biases can be modified with a computerized program called cognitive bias modification. And CBM has been touted by some as the sort of fifth wave of psychotherapy. And it's really an umbrella term to describe a whole host of interventions that target cognitive biases. But the two that have had the most attention in a sort of addiction context are attentional bias modification and approach bias modification. So with attentional bias modification, people are trained to divert their attention away from alcohol cues and towards non-alcohol cues. It was originally developed by Colin McLeod and his team over in WA, training people with anxiety disorders to divert their attention away from threatening cues and towards non-threatening cues. And it was a group of researchers in the Netherlands and Germany who had the idea of really applying this to an addiction context. So the second type of CBM, which I'm focusing on today, is approach bias modification. And this retrains an automatic tendency to approach bias to an automatic tendency to avoid it. And I'm going to share with you now, and hopefully it will work. It did when we did the test just before we started, a 1-minute animation that we had made up really to explain CBM to clients outside of a trial context at least. Let's see if this works.
Psychological research suggests that we are hardwired to push away or avoid things that we don't like, and to approach things that we do like, be that a cute puppy, chocolate cake, drugs, or alcohol. In people who drink frequently, alcohol cues such as places, sights, and sounds that remind us of drinking can subconsciously capture our attention. This can drive impulses to seek alcohol, and scientists call this tendency a cognitive bias. This automatic response to alcohol cues makes it difficult to resist drinking, even when we have other things planned. Thankfully, there is a new form of computerized brain training called cognitive bias modification. By repeatedly pushing away pictures of alcohol using a joystick and pulling healthier alternatives, we can interrupt the autopilot response to alcohol cues. Research has shown that just 4 10-minute training sessions can help people stop drinking up to 1 year later. So, is it time for you to override your alcohol autopilot?
Great, that worked. Let's just get back to the next slide. So we can measure approach bias with a computerized task where pushing on the joystick, as you just saw in the animation, that shrinks the size of the image, in this case a beer, as if moving away from it. And pulling on the joystick zooms in on the image as if approaching it. And essentially, if someone's quicker to pull or approach alcohol than they are to push or avoid alcohol relative to their response to non-alcohol or neutral cues, then they're considered to demonstrate an approach bias. But by getting them to repeatedly make an avoidance movement in response to alcohol cues and an approach movement in response to non-alcohol cues, we can retrain this or reverse this approach bias to an avoidance bias. However, it's important to know that in the training, participants are generally not told to push away alcohol and pull soft drink cues, but to make a push or pull response in relation to an irrelevant feature. And in our research, we use this picture frame orientation. So they're actually instructed to push on the joystick when they see a picture frame which has a portrait orientation, which shrinks the size of the picture, simulating this avoidance movement. And on 95% of the trials, an alcoholic drink will appear in the portrait frame. And they're told to pull on the joystick when they see the picture, where the picture frame has a landscape orientation, which zooms in on it, bringing it closer and simulating this approach movement. And on 95% of the trials, a landscape orientation will contain a non-alcoholic drink image. So in this way, people are attending to and responding to the picture frame, but in the background, they're actually being trained implicitly to avoid or reject alcohol cues. When we do this in the context of a randomized control trial, and we have what we call a sham training control condition, which is a sort of pretend version of the training, they generally push and pull alcohol and soft drink images 50% of the time. So there's actually no sort of systematic approach or avoidance training component to that. But it is a boring task. It is monotonous. It is repetitive. And typically they would do around 250 trials per session. But the idea is by repeatedly practicing avoiding alcohol, it then becomes more automatic and therefore less effortful in real life. This table here summarizes the CBM literature to date on people who are seeking treatment. Most of these have been double-blind randomized control trials, or many of them have been, I should say, and many of them have had very large samples, and most of them have been on alcohol, which you might expect. So the top half of the table, that's really a summary of the studies on attentional bias modification, and the bottom half, which is a slightly darker shade, approach bias modification. The first coloured column that you see there indicates whether or not the cognitive bias was successfully modified. So if it is attentional bias modification, did attentional bias reduce? Approach bias modification, did approach bias reduce? In some studies, and I'm guilty of those, you can see that the grey bar shows that they weren't assessed, and that's really because they were more sort of pilot feasibility studies where we didn't actually measure approach bias, we just measured the impact of the training on outcomes. The column on the right-hand side is actually indicates whether or not there were successful reductions in alcohol or drug use in the populations being targeted. And you can see overall there's a lot more green in the approach bias modification relative to the attentional bias modification studies, with more showing a reduction in the targeted mechanism, so approach bias, as well as reductions in alcohol, but also some studies noting reductions in cannabis or methamphetamine use. There's also been some randomized control systematic reviews of these randomized control trials and meta-analyses, which have largely confirmed this finding that we get a consistent, modest but significant effect of approach bias modification on preventing relapse following residential treatment. And there's now been somewhere in the realm of maybe 6-7 studies showing in large RCTs that 4 to 12 sessions of approach bias modification, around 15 minutes each session, when it's delivered during rehabilitation treatment, that can reduce alcohol by up to sort of 8 to 13%, even a whole year later after the training. Despite, sort of this growing body of literature in support for ABM, I'm going to just shorten it to ABM now, approach bias modification is too much of a mouthful. There does seem to be a lot of skepticism out there still, and I suspect it's probably because it just seems too simple. How could just pushing and pulling on a joystick actually achieve the same sort of effects as we see, in fact, better effects often than we see with medications that prevent relapse. But there have been 2 fMRI studies conducted which have shed some light on the targeted mechanisms, showing reduced neural activation in the amygdala, which is involved in craving, and in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for assigning the value of a rewarding stimuli and initiating a motor response to obtain a reward. And we see these reductions when participants are viewing alcohol cues after they've had 6 sessions of ABM, relative to the reductions in those brain regions when they've only received the sham training control condition of ABM. So what this suggests is ABM works by reducing the motivational salience or the value assigned to these alcohol cues. Oops, that's a good one. So in light of this emerging evidence at the time, a few years ago, we became interested in whether we can actually apply ABM during inpatient alcohol withdrawal treatment. This is because, as I'm sure you're well aware, it's the most common reason for seeking treatment, AOD treatment in Australia. In fact, the most recent AIHW AOD services survey indicated that nationally it accounts for 35% of clients, it's actually the primary drug of concern, and for a further 10% of clients, it's a secondary drug of concern. We also know that most clients relapse after a period of inpatient withdrawal. The literature suggests it's around 85% within 12 months, but we often see it within the first, that happening within the first few weeks, if not the first few days of leaving an inpatient withdrawal unit. And if you think about it, they're leaving this highly structured, highly protective environment, and then they're returning back home where they're suddenly bombarded by all these visual, auditory and olfactory alcohol cues that we know can trigger automatic impulses to drink. And let's be honest, it's pretty unavoidable in Australian society. So we were wondering if we could apply ABM during that inpatient withdrawal period to prevent early relapse. Particularly interested in that because we know that once people have resumed their sort of pre-detox levels of drinking, they're less likely to engage in outpatient counselling or aftercare, and probably going to engage in it to a lesser degree, even if they do, once drinking has resumed. So we wanted to see if we could, prevent that early relapse period. So we ran this randomised control trial. It was a pilot trial. Again, it was double blind, but with 83 participants in a single inpatient withdrawal unit in Melbourne. And essentially they got either 4 sessions of ABM, where they were pushing away local brands of alcoholic drinks and pulling non-alcoholic drinks, or they got a sham training control condition where they were responding to 2 sets of neutral stimuli. So they did 4 sessions. So those that did the 4 sessions actually reduced their relapse rates by 30%. So we had 75% report no alcohol use post-discharge in the ABM group in that first 2 weeks, compared to only 45% of the control group. And that was assuming that those lost to follow-up had resumed drinking. And with the intention to treat approach, where we looked at the differences between the 2 groups and those who did maybe just 1 session or at least 1 session of ABM, then we saw a 22% difference in those abstinence rates, which was just outside of statistical significance. So we then secured some funding from NH and MRC to essentially aiming to replicate that pilot study, but this time in a large, fully powered, multi-site, double-blind, randomized control trial. This study took about 3 years. We had 300 participants from 4 different withdrawal units in Melbourne. But again, they did the 4 consecutive days of training during their typically around 7-day inpatient withdrawal period. And we retained our primary outcome of complete abstinence from alcohol in that first 2-week period post-discharge. The key difference, I think, between this and the other trial was that the control group were exposed to the exact same stimuli. So they were responding to the same alcohol and the same non-alcohol stimuli, but rather than making an approach and pushing and pulling on a joystick, they were making lateral movements on the joystick. So they're moving it either left or right, depending on the orientation of that picture frame. So there was no approach avoidance training in that control group. We took a conservative approach again, assuming those that we were unable to recontact had continued drinking. And we found that with an intention to treat approach, so those who completed at least 1 session, there was a 12%, so significantly higher rate, a 12% higher rate of abstinence in the ABM group relative to the sham training control group. And with the per protocol analysis, which was those who got the intended 4 sessions of CBM, which typically started on day 3 of their inpatient stay, then they actually had a 17% higher rate of abstinence than the sham training controls. So 64% reported no alcohol use compared to only 47% in the controls. We actually had I haven't presented the data here today because we haven't published it yet, but we actually had an even stronger effect at 3 months in those that we followed up. So we followed up about, I think it was 90 90 or 91% at the 2-week follow-up. I think it was around 80 something for the 3-month follow-up. But yeah, we saw this effect, or the favourable outcomes for ABM had continued at 3 months, but unfortunately they were gone by 6 months, and by 12 months 80 to 85% of the sample had relapsed, and there were no differences. So on the positive side, this meant that we were able to replicate the finding of our pilot study, suggesting that ABM delivered as an adjunctive approach during inpatient withdrawal can actually help prevent early relapse. Oops, sorry, I think I've gone too fast. We also measured, this is another distinction between our pilot, we actually measured approach bias in this training. And as you can see, the figure on the left shows approach bias towards those alcohol cues that they saw in the training program. The blue bar, or the sort of teal color bar line, is the ABM group, and the purple line is the control group. And you can see there that there was a significant reduction in approach bias in the ABM group, from a mean approach bias pre-training to a mean avoidance bias post-training. Anything below the 0 line is in the avoidance range. And in the control group, it remained largely unchanged. And if you look at the figure on the right-hand side, this is response approach bias to non-alcohol cues. This was actually quite unexpected. We saw no change in the control group. We actually saw a almost significant increase in approach bias in the ABM group towards these non-alcohol images. And so this really got us wondering if, when we do ABM, we could simultaneously strengthen approach bias to something healthy or positive or goal-related, instead of strengthening an approach bias to soft drinks. This quote from somebody that we did a follow-up with really demonstrates how, well, at least from their perspective, ABM can be applied in real-world settings. So she told us, I went to buy my usual bottle of vodka from the bottle shop, but when I saw it there on the shelf, all I could think about was pushing it away from me, and I left the shop having not made a purchase. So that was good to see. We also asked participants to rate how much they wanted different alcoholic beverages. So we asked them to rate, we gave them 10 images, 5 of which they'd seen as part of the approach bias modification training task, and 5 which were entirely new, which they hadn't seen before. And we did that just to see whether the training generalizes to untrained images or novel images, which incidentally it did. So we asked them, how much do you want this particular drink? From not at all to, I would absolutely love this drink, as you can see there. And what this messy figure here illustrates is there's huge variation in how much people wanted certain drinks. I guess it's not surprising, but it was really clear that drink type and brand is important. And each one of these coloured lines represents a different participant, and you can see that some wanted almost all of the drinks to some degree, like the person represented by the orange line, who seemed to like them all except beer and white wine. And others seemed to be more, not fussy, but they weren't rating the others as high, such as the participant represented by the blue line, who for whom perhaps whiskey was their tipple. I do actually recall one female participant that I did the training with in one of the units, who showed this very sort of visceral response to almost all of the alcohol and non-alcohol images, in fact, and except for champagne. So that was, she said, this is all I drink. This is clearly the one that that resonates with me. So what this means is, for somebody who only drinks, say, red wine, being trained to repeatedly avoid images of beer or spirits may lack personal relevance, meaning that not only is it not relevant to them, but it could also mean that some of those trials are redundant. So again, this got us thinking about personalizing ABM, using self-selected and highly relevant stimuli as a way of making it more engaging and more effective. And of course, smartphones are a perfect way to do that, because you can take photos of or select the exact drinks or brands that you want to use. And of course, the other advantage is that it gets ABM beyond the residential treatment setting. Like online and e-interventions in general, mobile health interventions have received a fair bit of research attention in the last couple of decades, and for good reason. There's Alison Ritter has estimated through some modelling that the current demand for AOD treatment system is much greater than supply. So it's estimated it likely meets only 27 to 56% of the potential demand. So we really, this is a strong reminder, we really do need other options out there. We also know that only a minority of people with alcohol problems choose to seek professional treatment or are able to access professional treatment. The recent National Drug Strategy Household Survey indicated that only 10 to 25% of those with moderate to harmful drinking on the assist had ever received treatment. And of course, we know what the barriers are. We know it's often lack of access, lack of availability, stigma, lack of time, poor knowledge of what's out there, and also, the belief that it's not necessary and that people can address their problems on their own. And privacy concerns, that's another common one. But with approximately 90% of Australians now owning a smartphone, app-delivered interventions can overcome a lot of these barriers, including these sort of intermittent restrictions that we've had on face-to-face treatments due to the COVID-19 restrictions. Plus, mHealth alcohol interventions are generally low cost. They're often highly scalable. They're very convenient. They can often be anonymous. They can be accessed from pretty much anywhere as long as there's a Wi-Fi access, and can potentially even offer in the moment or just in time interventions. And whilst there are several apps out there in the stores, there's probably somewhere around 20 or 30, I think I've seen in Australia alone. Very few of them are actually backed by empirical evidence. There was a systematic review that was conducted, I think, at the end of 2019, and this identified 12 trials of alcohol reduction apps designed for adults. And of those, seven indicated reductions in the active intervention arm. 4 of them actually found no difference, and 1 reported an increase in alcohol consumption in the active intervention arm. But actually, only 5 of them were randomized control trials, of which only 2 demonstrated efficacy. So the findings are, I guess you could say, largely inconclusive, but it's also the picture's very much muddied by the fact that they tend to be targeting different mechanisms, or they're targeting the same mechanisms, but they're using a different intervention to do that. So you often see interventions or strategies such as normative feedback, self-monitoring, psychoeducation, action planning, goal setting, problem solving, identifying and managing triggers and cravings, that sort of thing. So yeah, lots of different mechanisms are being targeted, although broadly speaking, they do generally all aim to strengthen the sort of top-down conscious reflective processes to control drug seeking or alcohol consumption behavior, rather than the less conscious or implicit processes. At least that's been the case to date. 2 exceptions are 2 apps which actually did look at ABM. One in the UK, which was the Drink Less app, where Crane and colleagues tested, again, various combinations. They had 5 different modules: self-monitoring and feedback, action planning, identity change, normative feedback, and an ABM. As essentially, they were looking at which combinations of those worked best for people drinking at hazardous levels. And initially, they reported that the combination of normative feedback and ABM was one of only 2 combinations that did successfully reduce the audit score, so the alcohol problem score in that group. However, when they did the analyses later on with a larger sample, all evidence for efficacy of all of those combinations were lost. In Germany, they had, Lawrence and colleagues had the, I think it's pronounced Brinderbas app, and in this this is just purely ABM. Standard ABM, so fixed, standardized or standard set of alcohol and non-alcohol images that participants responded to, and they were recommended to do 2 weekly sessions for 3 weeks. But encouragingly, they found a reduction of a mean weekly reduction of 7.2 standard drinks, which is about a reduction of around 23%. That paper also reported on some of the feedback from participants, and it was largely positive, though some noted the lack of personalisation and the monotony and the repetitiveness of the training task, which is true, but it's unavoidable. And some suggested that game-like features could make it more engaging. And these criticisms of ABM, they are understandable, as participants in the studies do tend to get this fixed standardized set. And we know approach bias is generally the product of repeated associative experiences. So it's likely to be specific to the drinks that to the images that resemble the drinks that somebody frequently consumes, as we saw in our clinical trial data. So in our ABM app, we wanted participants to be able to personalize their training by avoiding or swiping away images of the exact beverages or brands that they regularly consume and want to drink less of or avoid, which we hypothesize or believe will increase engagement and effectiveness of ABM. Similarly, ABM trains people to approach a fixed set of non-alcohol beverages. And whilst these do have ecological validity as alternatives to alcoholic drinks, they are often unhealthy, they're often high in sugar content. And for some individuals, they may be associated with an alcoholic drink. If you think, orange juice with vodka and orange, or Coke with rum and Coke, or whiskey and Coke, and tonic water with gin and tonic. Plus, these two can be monotonous and have little relevance to patients. So we've been doing a trial with participants undergoing methamphetamine treatment, and we're really struggling to think what's a suitable approach stimuli that we can use. We did a pilot study and had fruit and veg as our approach stimuli, but when we wanted to run a sort of larger personalized version of ABM with that population, we worked with some consumer groups and ran some focus groups and got them to help us select appropriate images. And these really relate to sort of personally preferred healthy sources of pleasure, representing their sort of positive personal goals. So images symbolizing friends, family, social connection, pets, exercise, financial gain, that sort of thing, which much more closely align with patients' goals for behavior change in general. So we're doing that, or we were before COVID came along. We were running that trial where people selected their own, from a sort of suite of options, images that represented their personal goals. And in this way, we believe personalized ABM, when applied in an app for alcohol, could simultaneously weaken motivation to drink, whilst also reinforcing positive goals or motivations for drinking less. And we believe that this will increase not only its engagement, but its overall therapeutic benefit. So with Swipe, participants simply select from the app. There's a whole host of images in the app itself of alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks, or their camera roll, 6 images of the alcoholic drinks or brands they want to stop drinking or avoid drinking or drink less of. And essentially they repeatedly swipe those away on 92% of the trials, and they repeatedly approach 6 selected images of things they value, like photos of their family, friends, pets, hobbies, etc., reinforcing motivation for quitting or reducing on 92% of the trials. Swipe's discreet, it's anonymous, it takes around 3 to 5 minutes to complete each training session, and we recommended they do 2 sessions a week. It's drawing on the feedback from the Lawrence study. It's also gamified with scores for each trial to incentivize accuracy and speed, so that people can aim to try and beat their previous score, or indeed their personal best score, each training session, again, to try and increase engagement. It also measures craving immediately before and after each training session, and if there is a substantial jump in their craving score, then the app prompts a notification providing the details for a 24/7 professional support helplines. So whilst we had all these grand ideas about having this world-first personalised ABM app or this gamified app, of course we had no idea whether people would be interested in it, whether they would use it, if it would work, if they'd continue using it, and if it would work like the laptop and joystick version, which we'd done before. And so we had a number of hypotheses that we set out to test. We were really looking at its feasibility. So we aimed to recruit 500 Australians in the community who were drinking at harmful or hazardous levels, as indicated by the audit score, and who wanted to cut down on their drinking. And of course, we were looking at things like how many people signed up, how many people used it, and how long they used it. We also set out to look at its effectiveness. The primary outcome was a reduction in standard drinks, as we had in the Lawrence study. So looking at the standard drinks in the last week of training, in that 4-week training program relative to the week prior to training, that was a primary outcome. But we're also looking at changes in drinking days, alcohol dependence, and craving. And finally, acceptability. And we did this through looking at free text comments, some of the back-end data, but also using a standardized measure, the end user mobile acceptability rating scale. So essentially, after completing we actually recruited mostly through Facebook. So we sent out a few Facebook ads. Then that connected people to a baseline online survey where they reported their past month drinking days. And then once they downloaded the app, in the app itself, they would report their drinking days in the past month and their standard drinks per drinking day in the past week. But then select the images that they want to use in the approach and avoidance trials. And then they're pretty much ready to go. And yeah, we recommended 2 a week. There was a 24 lockout period, so they couldn't do more than, they had to wait 24 hours between doing their first and second session of each week, but they could do as many sessions as they wanted. And the app sent notifications or reminders of when they needed to do a training session, and weekly it would send notifications reminding them they need to report on their consumption data for that week. So the study was pre-registered with ANZ CTR. The results are currently under review. The journal has put up a preprint via the link there. But yeah, at this stage, some of these results, it's unlikely, but some of these results may change. So that's, I just thought I'd best highlight that, because yeah, it's not been accepted yet. So the study flow shows that we actually had 1,309. We had 2,338 complete the screening questionnaire. 1,309 participants actually got to download the app and start using Swipe over the 6-month recruitment period. And this was between sort of August 2020 through to February 2021. So yes, we had 500 people in the first month actually, which I think is testament to the level of interest in trying something new like ABM. So we were confident that it seemed to be feasible in that we had a reasonable uptake compared to our target of 500. And of those who commenced the training, 455, which is about a third of the sample, they completed the post-training follow-up questions. So that was after their 4th week of training. They got prompted by the app to tell, how many days have you drunk and how many drinks per day. And 437 did the Qualtrics survey. Then we had about 250 who completed the 1-month follow-up questions in the app. So 1 month after they finished the training program, they then completed some questions in the app itself. The mean number of training sessions was 6 and the median was 5. We also saw that 98% of the sessions that they'd commenced were completed. So this suggests that it's not particularly onerous or burdensome or difficult. And taken together, we saw these as indicators of its feasibility. So in terms of the sample characteristics, almost 60% were female, and the mean age was actually 47. It ranged from 18 up to, I think it was 77. We had quite a broad range, but a lot of people in their sort of 40s and 50s. They were drinking on average 5 days a week, and they were drinking on average 37 standard drinks a week. And the mean audit score was actually 21, so that's just inside the sort of likely or possible dependent range on that measure. In fact, 60% of them fell into that likely dependent range. And yet, despite that, only 9% reported that they were in treatment during the time that they were or had been in treatment. I think it was that year when they were using the app. And only 16% reported that they wanted to stop completely. The rest of them had the goal of reducing their alcohol consumption. This heat, I think it's called a heat map, shows that most of the participants were from, as you'd expect, the most populated cities, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. 2/3 of them resided in major cities and 1.5% in remote or very remote. And that blue dot that you can see in the Tasman Sea, that's actually Lord Howe Island. We had a participant there too. Okay, so now on to the juicy stuff. Well, in terms of its effectiveness and the primary outcome, we did indeed see a significant reduction in standard drinks. And among those who followed up, they had a mean baseline of 33 standard drinks in that week prior to training, and that dropped down to 24 in week 4 of training. So that's a mean reduction of 8.4 standard drinks, which is about 6 beers or a bottle of wine over that week. So this reduction was, encouraging, but I think what was more perhaps encouraging and unexpected was that this was maintained at the 1 month follow-up, at least among those who did the 1 month follow-up. We also saw a significant reduction in drinking days in week 4 relative to the week prior to training. This reduced from 5 down to 4 essentially, and again remained at just 4 drinking days a week at the 1 month follow-up. This just shows the split between the male and female participants. So you can see that largely, as you'd expect, lower number of standard drinks at all time points in women, and yeah, but essentially the same trend. We also saw significant differences in drinking days in the month. So what I presented earlier was drinking days in the past week. But when we looked back at how many drinking days they had in the month prior to starting the training relative to when they were doing the training relative to post-training, all of those time points showed differences in the number of drinking days. And we saw a significant reduction in the mean score on the severity of dependence scale, indicating lowered alcohol dependence after training, and significant reductions in craving as well on the craving experiences questionnaire. We actually saw a significant interaction between the number of training sessions and reduction on that craving score on both the total score and 2 of its 3 subscales, suggesting that the more sessions, more swipe training sessions people did, the more their craving reduced. This figure shows that the changes in craving immediately and after each training session were significant as well. So participants rated on this slider their craving from no craving at all through to 100, which would be extreme craving, immediately before and after each session. The red bar represents the mean scores prior to each training session, and the greeny blue colour immediately after. And as you can see, there were significant drops in each, significant reduction in craving within each training session, but also a reduction over time across among those who did all 8 sessions. And finally, in terms of acceptability, mean scores on the UMARS, the Mobile Application Rating Scale. This was good for functionality and aesthetics and acceptable subjective quality, indicating good acceptability overall. You can see the score descriptors on the left there. We also had some free text comments provided in the Qualtrics survey. Generally, the positive comments were that they liked the fact that it was really simple and quick and easy to use, minimal onboarding, and they loved the personalization aspect of it. Negative comments were, a lot of them were in relation to the bugs that some people experience and that you always get with apps, or at least early versions of an app. The 24-hour lockout, they wanted to do sessions exactly when they wanted to. They didn't want to have to wait 24 hours. And the usual concerns with ABM, that it's repetitive and monotonous. So that was not surprising. But yeah, we had some really, really useful feedback from participants. Having said that, 8 out of 10, or 80, well, the figures jump there, 83% did say that they would recommend it to others. Some of the free text comments indicated that for some participants, as well as helping them to reduce their drinking, it increased, or they believed it increased their uptake of healthy activities and behaviours, which sometimes related to the images that they repeatedly approached in the training. I recall one participant saying that whenever they were tempted to reach for the fridge to grab a bottle of wine, this image of them finishing a 10K race, finishing at the finish line, would pop into their head, or an image of their niece or nephew would pop into their head. And as you can see here, the quote on the left-hand side, this female participant told us, "My desire for a drink was much less. It's good to be reminded of things in life that alcohol is stealing from you." Another one showed, incredible uptake in healthy behaviour and activities. They told us that during the experiment, they consulted a doctor, they got meds to help. I've improved my relationships with my loved ones. I'm eating better. I've joined a gym, which I'm loving. I'm running again. I've had more alcohol-free days this month than I've had in maybe 2 years. I look at the positive images I chose, and it's spooky how they've all come true. And then we also had one that told us, when I thought about going past the bottle shop and grabbing a 6-pack, I used some of the pictures like the wallet to remind me, no, just go home and have an alcohol-free night, and it worked. So there was some evidence that how they were, their drinking and perhaps other behaviours may have related to the images that they selected in the training task. We've also done 18 in-depth qualitative interviews on people's experiences of swipe, which are in the process of being analysed now by a PhD student. And here's just a couple which sort of speaks to how they perceive it as a tool for either disrupting or delaying these automatic and habitual drinking behaviours. So one told us, I find moments now where I really stop and think before I go to the fridge. It's almost like it was a bit of a circuit breaker in my thinking pattern. I'm not saying it's every day or anything, but it's almost like I have a space between, oh, I want a drink, and I'm not going to have one now. Well, I'm not going to have one right now. And another told us, when I get home, rather than pouring a glass of wine in my first hour or so of being home, I might actually delay that based on using the app to remind myself that, oh, yes, okay, so these are the positive things I've said, and these are the negative things I'm trying to avoid. We'll hopefully have a lot more of the qualitative data out soon. How am I doing for time? Oh, yes, nearly there. Right, it's a quick summary then. So these studies provide further evidence that ABM is an effective intervention that boosts abstinence following residential treatment, and given how safe and easy and simple it is to administer, that it's low cost. The biggest challenge is actually trying to get your hands on a decent joystick these days, as they're largely obsolete. But other than that, it just requires a laptop and a joystick. So on the basis of that, we would recommend it as an adjunctive approach to help prevent early relapse. And indeed, it was added to the most recent edition of the National Alcohol Treatment Guidelines as a relapse prevention tool. The findings of our open label trial of swipe suggest personalised ABM is feasible and acceptable, and there's preliminary evidence for its effectiveness to reduce alcohol consumption, quantity, craving, and dependence. And it's really encouraging that we've had similar results to the Lawrence study, the German study, and particularly that it seems to reduce craving immediately after each training session. But of course, we have to keep in mind that this is an open label trial. A major limitation is that we didn't have a control group. Everybody knew that they were trying something new, a brain training that could help them reduce their alcohol use. So there's expectancy effects. And with like all EM health interventions, we had a high attrition rate, which means that those who did the follow-ups may have been those who are more likely to have engaged more in the app and therefore had better or greater reductions in their alcohol use. Nonetheless, the findings are promising and warrant an examination on the efficacy of smartphone-delivered ABM in randomised control trials. And that's exactly what we're doing now. So I have a PhD student who's looking to see how it works with people in the community, middle to older age adults. And also we have some funding from the Victorian Department of Health and the ADRIA scheme to see whether it can actually support clients in alcohol treatment in 6 AOD services in Melbourne. So those studies are underway, and yeah, maybe I can come back in a year or so and share the findings on those. But otherwise, I'm done. I'd just like to acknowledge the incredible team, my collaborators, the many students I've had the pleasure of working with, and the kindness of participants giving their time. And yeah, and thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take questions.
Victoria, thank you very much. And I'll answer one question first, which is, can you come back? Yes, please. Look, certainly, thank you for for taking what is a huge scope of this process that you've gone through, building on the research that's already been done, building on, I guess, decades of things that we've started to look at through all the different waves of these treatments. And I'm still getting my head around the 4th wave, so thank you for introducing the 5th wave. So I guess a couple of questions that have come out of the from the chat today, And I think a lot of people found, as I did myself, it's kind of like I had a question and then it was answered. So, thank you for the I guess the depth and the comprehensiveness of what you presented. Just a couple of things. So originally in the original CBM theory, there was the use of that orientation, portrait versus landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's kind of a bit like cue exposure by stealth in a way, but in terms of the responses. But then the trial that you've just done has shifted a lot more towards personalised and specific stimulus that are relevant to a person. So it's a bit of a shift away from that. Is there any kind of benefit more from one from the other, or is it too early?
Yeah, so the I probably didn't make it very clear, but when they have alcohol versus personalised images, it's still either within the portrait or landscape. So they are still meant to be responding to the picture frame orientation.
Understood.
But on 92% of the trials, the portrait will contain alcohol, which they're pushing away, and 92% of the landscape frame images will contain their positive image, which they'll be putting towards them. Yeah, swiping towards them rather.
Great. No, thank you. That's I didn't know there'd been a shift in kind of some of the understanding of the theory, but that's brilliant. Thank you. A couple of other questions, particularly say in your research. I know you said the mean age was 47.
Mm.
So certainly in all the reviews that you've done of the reviews and the different trials and studies, was there much work in this field with young people?
That's a good question, because there's only with the apps there's only been those 2 studies. I can't recall the mean age on those or the spread. I mean, it's surprising actually, because we thought, oh, it's an app, we're going to have much greater uptake among people in their 20s. But we didn't. Yeah. We actually had much more in the 40s and 50s. With CBM literature in general, there are a couple, but they tend to be on students. Looking at, can we give a single session to students and to who are generally not as motivated to change their drinking. And that's one of the kind of interesting things about the CBM literature, is that it seems to work in people who are wanting to change, wanting to reduce their drinking, and they're perhaps receiving CBT or other things that are part of that. But Katrina Pryor, who's at University of Sydney, she's doing some great work. She's actually applying CBM, approach bias modification, with interpretation bias modification, looking at young adults with both alcohol and social anxiety disorder. So she's doing some great work in that area. Yeah.
Yes, sure. No, thank you for that. With the trials that you've seen, and certainly the one that you've conducted, was the ABM standalone? Was there any exclusion criteria or inclusion criteria about other people engaged in other adjunct interventions or treatments, or was it always
in the clinical trial?
Yes.
Yeah. No, so they were in inpatient withdrawal. So yeah, they may have gone on to receive hopefully went on to receive outpatient counselling or rehab, or perhaps aftercare, peer support, that sort of thing. But because it was a randomised controlled trial, we assume that that's going to be the case, a roughly equivalent number or proportion in each group. We're in the process of looking at the data of service use post discharge, as well as also looking at things like acute service use as well. So we can look at the impact on demand on things like hospitalisation, ambulance call outs, that sort of thing. So we will get a sense of just how much they were connected with the broader treatment system once we look at that data. But yeah, I mean, the only exclusion criteria really were not, I think, colour blindness and major head injuries or severe cognitive impairment and severe sort of psychosis or psychiatric conditions. Really, we left it to the clinicians we had criteria, but the clinicians made the final call on whether somebody was suitable or not, based on the, how they were presenting and feeling. Sure.
So this could be in combination with other evidence-based sort of interventions as well. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and that's I mean, it's not. I don't see it as a standalone intervention, because it's only doing one thing. It's only targeting the implicit processes. And we know so much. You need, ideally, you want both, and that's what counselling deals with, the top-down Yep.
executive control. And so this is really addressing something that isn't typically addressed in treatment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's warms my heart, because there's not a lot that we can claim to be standalone in our field.
You're not going to be replaced by a joystick.
You mentioned colourblindness, which of course that makes logical sense, but also we had a question around any kind of with vision impairment. Is that sort of something that has been considered in this?
Well, not in my research, but there's certainly some researchers over in I think Germany, where they're looking at auditory cues, and there's been, I mean, it's really taken off, this literature. There's I mean, this doesn't address the real issue, what you've just raised in terms of vision impairment, but VR as well is another platform or paradigm in which this has been explored in some recent studies. But yeah, I think there's a lot more we can do rather than just, you know, the traditional kind of respond to an image in the center of the screen.
Yeah, virtual reality, of course, that would be amazing. And I'm glad you kind of steered away from the fruit and veg being the only contingency.
Yeah. Well, we really didn't know what to do, but I mean, we got actually some, they quite liked the fruit and veg images in the very first sort of feasibility study we did, but it was really when we were doing the proper trial, we said, okay, what can we use? And it was so helpful. We're so grateful for the people that we worked with at APSU who basically went, no, you don't want these images. This is what you need. And it was, it was so great to have them on board.
No, perfect. Just a question about the research that was pre and post done on the biases, the attentional biases. Were there any non-self-report measures used to be able to collect that information?
On the drinking days and...
sorry, no, just in terms of the actual measures of the underlying mechanisms of attentional and approach bias.
Yes, yes. So that figure I showed of the reduction in approach bias, that was through what we call the approach-avoidance test. So that measures approach bias. So we gave them essentially a measure of their approach bias. They then did the 4 ABM sessions, and then we measured approach bias again using that computerized task.
Sure.
So it wasn't self-report. That was actually demonstrated approach bias. Yeah.
Sure. Is that like time spent or?
Yeah, exactly. It's basically the difference between push and pull alcohol versus push and pull soft drinks.
Yeah, good. No, thank you. And just a question here, is the app available now?
Well, we've changed it slightly for the randomized control trials that we're doing now. We're hoping to get it out there. I haven't been able to secure enough funding from the usual funder type bodies to really put all the features that I would love to have in this app, and to have an ongoing program so people aren't limited to this 4-week program. So that's the intention. That's why we're exploring commercialization, very early stages, to see whether, you know, that might be an avenue for us getting it out there with some really engaging features, and you know, not just doing approach bias modification, but other things that we know keep people engaged. So that's the plan.Maybe next year.
Yeah, well, that's not that far away, actually.
No, it's not.
Talk about it. Just 2 more questions. I'll recheck my notes just to make sure I'm not bringing things. And I also really want to thank you, particularly at the end there, bringing in the qualitative information, bringing in the client voices around their experiences. I think that's always incredibly important to also understand. Just in relation to a question here, it came a bit earlier on in the session today, so therefore some of the portability with things like the swipe app that you mentioned might have already addressed some of this, but looking at how this would look outside of a treatment setting, because joysticks, as you mentioned, and computers and screens may not be all that practical. Also, and this is my experience as well, not particularly given that we're using a lot more kind of remote modalities for engaging with clients at the moment during COVID, that not all clients have really good access to mobile phones or data and phones that support this. There was an interesting suggestion here. Things like, has there ever this sort of work ever been done with things like decks of cards, or more kind of, I guess, those types of low tech type modalities?
Not that I'm aware of. It would be hard because it has to be timed. So with such precision, the presentation of the stimuli and the speed with which it disappears, that all has to be controlled and standardized. Yep. So it would be hard to do that. So Katrina Pryor and her group are doing an online ABM training task where they move a mouse to shrink and zoom in and out on the image. So it doesn't have to be a phone. I know there's some people in Europe that are exploring its use on an iPad, but also not swiping on the phone itself, but actually moving the phone away from them. And there's also some researchers at Monash who have come up with a tilt task where you tilt it away. There's been some research where you tilt the phone away to shrink the image or towards you to zoom in on the image. But ultimately, that still requires a mobile phone.
But certainly, as you've indicated, this does allow things to be disseminated a lot more widely and make it accessible. Even if it is an adjunct, it's still a very supportive and a growing evidence base around it. The 24-hour lockout, given that that was in the trial, have any early thoughts around whether that will transfer over when it comes?
That will definitely not transfer over. That was a bad call on our part. We just thought people would be bored and wouldn't want to do 2 sessions in 24 hours. But the reality is if they downloaded the app and started at, say, midday, they couldn't then do another session until midday, 24 hours later, but they actually wanted to do a session maybe later that night, you know. The great thing about, they want to do it when they're experiencing craving or urges. So, we won't have a 24-hour lockout on future versions, definitely.
Yeah, no, that's, yes, that again, no, it's good. Everything.
And I should also say that in the swipe pilot trial, or study, I should say, the only 9, we don't know if they were receiving other types of support because we had minimal questions, but only 9% told us they were in treatment. So for say 90% of the participants, it probably was a standalone support tool, for them.
Yeah. No, thank you for coming back to that one. Now, I'll just check with my colleague, Niall, who's been monitoring the chat while I've been talking to you. It looks like there's one more. I'm aware that we've gone a little over 11, so I hope that's okay with you, Professor Manning, that we can hang around for a few moments. Sure. And anyone else who's stayed with us, thank you for hanging in there. So did the design take into consideration any cultural considerations for users? Or?
When we selected the image, you talked for the swipe trial, we selected, we were limited to how many we could have, otherwise people would be scrolling through the app to pick the best images, but we were absolutely trying to represent genders, ages, cultures, sexual orientation, partnerships, that sort of thing. We had families that were not, mum, dad, 2 kids. We had all combinations of families, as many as we could. I think we had about 100 images in there. So people could, use images in their phone that they perhaps felt they related to, but we really encouraged them to use their own images in their photo libraries of their situations.